Howdy, folks. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, I have a new Dungeons and Dragons video because I'm going to be taking some time today to talk about mercenary companies, the history of, and pretty much kind of give you an idea of how you would use mercenary companies within your Dungeons and Dragons campaign. I've actually used them myself over the years, as well as I've had campaigns where players ran mercenary companies. So let's kind of dive on into it. And essentially, the place to really start is just kind of looking through history of how mercenary companies worked and why the need of them even exists in the first place. Because essentially, well, one of the oldest professions known to man is actually being a professional soldier. Pretty much, it's been the dawn of time. There's been need for professional soldiers. And with that being said, ever since there's been a need for professional soldiers, there's been a need for force multipliers, or essentially mercenaries. Now, mercenaries, unlike regular soldiers during the medieval period would serve various medieval lords, may it be dukes or counts. They would serve kings, while mercenaries kind of served themselves and were nothing more than basically contracted soldiers. Now, within the contracts of itself, the contracts would actually, they would be contracted to such and such, may it be a duke, a count, a baron, a king. They would be contacted to somebody directly. And within the contract, it would outline their pay and what their role is for and how long it's going to be. It may be kind of outlined by a certain amount of battles. It might be a time frame where it could be like 100 days or 6 months, a year, whatever. And of course, that's going to be based on what type of role they're going to fulfill. Now, when it comes to the roles they're going to fulfill, well, that's going to vary. It could be anything from being frontline troops to essentially border guards. Could be town guards for what it matters. Could be garrison troops, where essentially all they're doing is basically taking care of a garrison and basically providing security for said garrison, so that way the regular soldiers who's fighting a war could actually essentially take a break. They would also provide other roles and services, and essentially it would be based on what the mercenary unit would look like. Now, of course, when it comes to the composition of a mercenary unit, a lot of them would be basically infantry-based units. Now, some of them would get more specialized, where basically you would have pikemen. Of course, these were popular actually during the days of pike and shot tactics, where essentially you would have pike and shot mercenary units. They could also fulfill the role of being archers or crossbowmen, maybe a little mix of both, as well as siege engineers, because siege engineers was definitely really important. And actually, a mercenary company of siege engineers could actually make a lot of money. But with that being said, they were also definitely going to be locked into a contract for a long-term basis. Now, with that being said, mercenary companies could also serve as cavalry as well, and this was another popular option, was to essentially have cavalry-based mercenary units. And of course, the pay would be essentially based on the role that they're fulfilling, may it be as garrison troops, may it be as frontline troops. Essentially, the higher the risk, the more rewards. It would also basically be based on what type of unit. An infantry unit per se may not get paid as well as a cavalry unit, and probably the highest paid would actually be a siege engineer unit, if you will. Now, reputation and length of time would also indicate how much these units were going to be getting paid, because essentially a higher reputation a mercenary unit has, the more likely they're going to be able to demand more money. Of course, the length of time also goes into play there, and that's probably going to be one of the more major roles, because essentially the longer a mercenary unit is going to be in service for with whoever, the more they're going to demand for pay. Now, mercenary units are going to be in service with essentially some high lord or cane. That's just pretty much going to be straight out. Now, maybe a smaller mercenary unit might be in service of a merchant's guild or something along that line, providing security for your merchants or travelers, if you will. They may provide security for goods. They may even check goods if, say, the Merchants Guild is using mercenaries as essentially, I guess you'd want to call them almost like dock workers or something along that line, where they're receiving goods, they're checking and making sure everything is legit, things of that nature. Now, one thing that's got to be put out there, and I have to emphasize this, even though I did touch base a little bit ago about reputation with mercenaries units was very important. If they had a reputation of basically getting a contract and completing that contract until the very end, and maybe even in some cases extending contracts so they can continue service with a king or a lord, they would tend to have a really good reputation, which would also allow them to demand more pay. I know I said that a bit ago, but it's got to be highlighted because the other thing that to go on is if they have a reputation for not fulfilling their contracts or essentially breaking contracts, etc., then that's not going to fetch them as much pay. So with that being said, being a mercenary leader was actually a very difficult job because essentially you had to be charismatic enough to be a businessman. You had to understand negotiation, how to haggle, things of that nature, but then you also had to lead your forces into battle. So essentially you were a pseudo general, if you will. Well, maybe not so much a general as much as a captain, but it still remains that you were also a military officer as a mercenary captain, but you also had to be charismatic and sharp enough to also be a businessman, which definitely makes that task very hard. With that being said, mercenary companies could be very lucrative. We have to really look no further than the 100 Years' War. Mercenaries were very heavily employed. Actually, so much so that certain kingdoms and countries, etc., started putting bans on mercenaries because essentially a lot of how would you want to put it? But basically, essentially, countries like Italy, if you will, would have issues where mercenaries were basically pouring into Italy and raiding different towns, cities, and merchant lines. And essentially, it was causing so much problems that Italy had generally put a ban on mercenaries in general. And basically, it was being a mercenary was punishable by death. Actually, it got so out of control. And even the church, if you will, also had bans on mercenaries as well, which shows you how much religion had control over basically Italy at one point in time. But this also pretty much constantly kept mercenaries employed as they were able to kind of just pack up their stuff and move on if things got too hot and heavy. Now, of course, they would try to fulfill out their contract and things of that nature. And I'm actually going to discuss ways out of a contract here in a little bit. But this did give mercenary units some autonomy from standard military forces. So that was also kind of important for mercenary groups in general, especially in times of peace. If they're, say, a group of German mercenaries and Germany is in general peace, but France is at constant war, then it wouldn't be rare for a mercenary unit to kind of pack up their things and go to France because that's where the money is. Now, there are several ways out of a contract. One could be an agreement between the mercenary captain and essentially the contractor, whoever that is, may it be the king or leader from the Merchants Guild or whatever. Maybe they would essentially come to an agreement and the mercenary company could get out of their contract through agreement. Another way would also be who the contractor, if you will, or would he be the contractee? I guess he'd be the contractor. But if he died, then the mercenary company would obviously be free of their contract as they're no longer obligated to anyone. Now, with that being said, smart mercenary units would definitely, per se, if the king died, would try to start a contract almost instantly with the prince who is soon going to become the king. And that's going to be a give or take on that one because honestly, if the prince is not a well liked person, then they're going to want out of the. They're just going to want to get out of there. But with that being said, other ways would be obviously fulfilling the contract, may be whatever it is, may it be time based, the amount of battles, service length, whatever. So that would be another thing that would get mercenary companies out of their contracts. Also, of course, if something happens and say the contractor is, if it's during a war situation and the contractor is captured and locked into a prison, that would obviously let them out of their contract as well, because honestly, at that point, they're not getting paid, which is another core thing that would get them out of their contract. If the person they are contracted to is not fulfilling their end of the bargain, such as paying them, then they would obviously get out of the contract. Now, with that being said, players as mercenaries, I mean, realistically, if you do anything that's for money, that's essentially strong arming, yeah, you're kind of a bit of a mercenary yourself. So most players at one point or another within Dungeons and Dragons are going to be mercenaries. And honestly, mercenary players are or playing as a mercenary within Dungeons and Dragons, I think, is really good. It's a good way to go because it's a great way to make money, great way to make treasure, and essentially gain some fame, if you will. So players out there, one point or another, you've all probably been mercenaries within Dungeons and Dragons. Anyway, folks, hopefully you all enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourself a wonderful day.